warriors of either sex in all of Menzoberranzan. Besides Brizza and her mother, both high priestesses of the Spider Queen, Zaknafine, with his unrivaled swordsmanship, was House Do'Urden's trump. Zak held up the black hood and opened the small pouch on his belt, revealing several tiny ceramic spheres. Brizza smiled evilly and rubbed her slender hands together. "Matron Genevieve will not be pleased," she whispered. Zak returned the smile and turned to view the departing soldiers. Nothing gave the weapon master more pleasure than killing drow elves, particularly clerics of Loth. "Prepare yourself," Brizza said after a few minutes. Zak shook his thick hair back from his face and stood rigid, eyes tightly closed. Brizza drew her wand slowly, beginning the chant that would activate the device. She tapped Zak on one shoulder, then the other, then held the wand motionless over his head. Zak felt the frosty sprinkles falling down on him, permeating his clothes and armor, even his flesh, until he and all of his possessions had cooled to a uniform temperature and hue. Zak hated the magical chill. It felt as he imagined death would feel, but he knew that under the influence of the wand's sprinkles he was, to the heat-sensing eyes of the creatures of the Underdark, as gray as common stone, unremarkable and undetectable. Zak opened his eyes and shuddered, flexing his fingers to be sure they could still perform the fine edge of his craft. He looked back to Brizza, already in the midst of the second spell, the summoning. This one would take a while, so Zak leaned back against the wall and considered again the pleasant, though dangerous task before him. How thoughtful of Matron Malice to leave all of House de Vere's clerics to him. "It is done," Brizza announced after a few minutes. She led Zak's gaze upward to the darkness beneath the unseen ceiling of the immense cavern. Zak spotted Brizza's handiwork first, an approaching current of air, yellow-tinted and warmer than the normal air of the cavern. A living current of air. The creature, a conjuration from an elemental plane, swirled to hover just beyond the lip of the balcony, obediently awaiting its summoner's commands. Zak didn't hesitate. He leaped out into the thing's midst, letting it hold him suspended above the floor. Brizza offered him a final salute and motioned her servant away. "Good fighting," she called to Zak, though he was already invisible in the air above her. Zak chuckled at the irony of her words as the twisting city of Menzoberranzan rolled out below him. She wanted the clerics of House de Vere dead as surely as Zak did, but for very different reasons. All complications aside, Zak would have been just as happy killing clerics of House Do'Urden. The weapon master took up one of his adamantite swords, a drow weapon magically crafted and unbelievably sharp with the edge of killing dwomers. "Good fighting indeed," he whispered. If only Brizza knew how good. 2. The Fall of House de Vere. Dinnan noted with satisfaction that any of the meandering bugbears or any other of the multitude of races that composed Menzoberranzan, drow included, now made great haste to scurry out of his way. This time the second boy of House Do'Urden was not alone. Nearly 60 soldiers of the house walked in tight lines behind him. Behind these, in similar order, though with far less enthusiasm for the adventure, came 100 armed slaves of lesser races, goblins, orcs, and bugbears. There could be no doubt for onlookers. A drow house was on a march to war. This was not an everyday event in Menzoberranzan, but neither was it unexpected. At least once every decade, a house decided that its position within the city hierarchy could be improved by another house's elimination. It was a risky proposition, for all of the nobles of the victim house had to be disposed of quickly and quietly. If even one survived to lay an accusation upon the perpetrator, the attacking house would be eradicated by Menzoberranzan's merciless system of justice. If the raid was executed to devious perfection, though, no recourse would be forthcoming. All of the city, even the ruling council of the top 8 matron mothers, would secretly applaud the attackers for their courage and intelligence, and no more would ever be said of the incident. Dinin took a roundabout route, not wanting to lay a direct trail between House Do'Urden and House de Vere. A half-hour later, for the second time that night, he crept to the mushroom grove's southern end, to the cluster of stalagmites that held House de Vere. His soldiers streamed out behind him eagerly, readying weapons and taking full measure of the structure before them. The slaves were slower in their movements. Many of them looked about for some escape, for they knew in their hearts that they were doomed in this battle. They feared the wrath of the Dark Elves more than death itself, though, and would not attempt to flee. With every exit out of Menzoberranzan protected by devious drow magic, where could they possibly go? Every one of them had witnessed the brutal punishments the drow elves exacted on recaptured slaves. At Dinin's command, they jumped into their positions around the mushroom fence. Dinin reached into his large pouch and pulled out a heated sheet of metal. He flashed the object, brightened in the infrared spectrum, 3 times behind him to signal the approaching brigades of Nalfine and Rissyn. Then, with his usual cockiness, Dinin spun it quickly into the air, caught it, and replaced it in the secrecy of his heat-shielding pouch. On cue with the twirling signal, Dinin's drow brigade fitted enchanted darts to their tiny handheld crossbows and took aim on the appointed targets. Every 5th mushroom was a shrieker, and every dart held a magical dwomer that could silence the roar of a dragon. 2, 3, Dinin counted, his hand signaling the tempo since no words could be heard within the sphere of magical silence cast about his troops. He imagined the click as the drawn string on his little weapon released, loosing the dart into the nearest shrieker. So it went all around the cluster of House de Vere, the first line of alarm systematically silenced by 3 dozen enchanted darts. Halfway across Menzoberranzan, Matron Malice, her daughters, and 4 of the house's common clerics were gathered in Loth's unholy circle of 8. They ringed an idol of their wicked deity, a gemstone carving of a drow-faced spider, and called to Loth for aid in their struggles. Malice sat at the head, propped in a chair angled for birthing. Brizza and Virna flanked her, Brizza clutching her hand. The select group chanted in unison, combining their energies into a single offensive spell. A moment later, when Virna, mentally linked to Dinin, understood that the first attack group was in position, the Do'Urden circle of 8 sent the first insinuating waves of mental energy into the rival house. Matron Genevieve, her 2 daughters, and the 5 principal clerics of the common troops of House de Vere huddled together in the darkened anteroom of the 5 stalagmite house's main chapel. They had gathered there in solemn prayer every night since Matron Genevieve had learned that she had fallen into Loth's disfavor. Genevieve understood how vulnerable her house remained until she could find a way to appease the Spider Queen. There were 66 other houses in Menzoberranzan, fully 20 of which might dare to attack House de Vere at such an obvious disadvantage. The 8 clerics were anxious now, somehow suspecting that this night would be eventful. Genevieve felt it first, a chilling blast of confusing perceptions that caused her to stutter over her prayer of forgiveness. The other clerics of House de Vere glanced nervously at the matron's uncharacteristic slip of words, looking for confirmation. "We are under attack," Genevieve breathed to them, her head already pounding with a dull ache under the growing assault of the formidable clerics of House Do'Urden. A second signal from Dinnan put the slave troops into motion. Still using stealth as their ally, they quietly rushed to the mushroom fence and cut through with wide-bladed swords. The second boy of House Do'Urden watched and enjoyed as the courtyard of House de Vere was easily penetrated. "Not such a prepared guard," he whispered in silent sarcasm to the red-glowing gargoyles on the high walls. The statues had seemed such an ominous guard earlier that night. Now they just watched helplessly. Dinnan recognized the measured but growing anticipation in the soldiers around him. Their drow battle lust was barely contained. Every now and then came a killing flash as one of the slaves stumbled over a warding glyph, but the second boy and the other drow only laughed at the spectacle. The lesser races were the expendable fodder of House Do'Urden's army. The only purpose in bringing the goblinoids to House de Vere was to trigger the deadly traps and defenses along the perimeter, to lead the way for the drow elves, the true soldiers. The fence was now opened and secrecy was thrown away. House de Vere's soldiers met the invading slaves head-on within the compound. Dinnan barely had his hand up to begin the attack command when his 60 anxious drow warriors jumped up and charged, their faces twisted in wicked glee and their weapons waving menacingly. They halted their approach on cue, though, remembering one final task set out to them. Every drow, noble or commoner, possessed certain magical abilities. Bringing forth a globe of darkness, as Dinnan had done to the bugbears in the street earlier that night, came easily to even the lowliest of the Dark Elves. So it went now, with 60 Do'Urden soldiers blotting out the perimeter of House de Vere above the mushroom fence in ball after ball of blackness. For all of their stealth and precautions, House Do'Urden knew that many eyes were watching the raid. Witnesses were not too much of a problem. They could not or would not care enough to identify the attacking house. But custom and rules demanded that certain attempts at secrecy be enacted, the etiquette of drow warfare. In the blink of a red-glowing drow eye, House de Vere became, to the rest of the city, a dark blot on Menzo Baranzan's landscape. Rissyn came up behind his youngest son. "Well done," he signaled in the intricate finger language of the drow. "Now Fine is in through the back." "An easy victory," the cocky Dinnan signaled back, "if Matron Genevieve and her clerics are held at bay." "Trust in Matron Malice," was Rissyn's response. He clapped his son's shoulder and followed his troops in through the breached mushroom fence. High above the cluster of House de Vere, Zaknafine rested comfortably in the current arms of Brizza's aerial servant, watching the drama unfold. From this vantage, Zak could see within the ring of darkness and could hear within the ring of magical silence. Dinnan's troops, the first drow soldiers in, had met resistance at every door and were being beaten badly. Now Fine and his brigade, the troops of House Do'Urden most practiced in the ways of wizardry, came through the fence at the rear of the complex. Lightning strikes and magical balls of acid thundered into the courtyard at the base of the de Vere structures, cutting down Do'Urden fodder and de Vere defenses alike. In the front courtyard, Rissyn and Dinnan commanded the finest fighters of House Do'Urden. The blessings of Loth were with his house, Zak could see when the battle was fully joined, for the strikes of the soldiers of House Do'Urden came faster than those of their enemies, and their aim proved more deadly. In minutes, the battle had been taken fully inside the 5 pillars. Zack stretched the incessant chill out of his arms and willed the aerial servant to action. Down he plummeted on his windy bed, and then he fell free the last few feet to the terrace along the top chambers of the central pillar. At once 2 guards, one a female, rushed out to greet him. They hesitated in confusion, though, trying to sort out the true form of this unremarkable gray blur. Too long. They had never heard of Drizzt Do'Urden. They didn't know that death was upon them. Zack's whip flashed out, catching and gashing the female's throat, while his other hand walked his sword through a series of masterful thrusts and parries that put the male off balance. Zack finished both in a single blurring movement, snapping the whip-entwined female from the terrace with a twist of his wrist, and spinning a kick into the male's face that likewise dropped him to the cavern floor. Zack was then inside, where another guard rose up to meet him, but fell at his feet. Zack slipped along the curving wall of the stalactite tower, his cooled body blending perfectly with the stone. Soldiers of House de Vere rushed all about him, trying to formulate some defense against the host of intruders who had already won out the lowest level of every structure and had taken 2 of the pillars completely. Zack was not concerned with them. He blocked out the clanging ring of adamantite weapons, the cries of command, and the screams of death, concentrating instead on a singular sound that would lead him to his destination. A unified, frantic chant. He found an empty corridor covered with spider carvings and running into the center of the pillar. As in House Do'Urden, this corridor ended in a large set of ornate double doors, their decorations dominated by arachnid forms. "This must be the place," Zack muttered under his breath, fitting his hood to the top of his head. A giant spider rushed out of its concealment to his side. Zack dove to his belly and kicked out under the thing, spinning into a roll that plunged his sword deep into the monster's bulbous body. Sticky fluids gushed out over the weapon master, and the spider shuddered to a quick death. "Yes," Zack whispered, wiping the spider juices from his face. "This must be the place." He pulled the dead monster back into its hidden cubby and slipped in beside the thing, hoping that no one had noticed the brief struggle. By the sounds of ringing weapons, Zack could tell that the fighting had almost reached this floor. House de Vere now seemed to have its defenses in place, though, and was finally holding its ground. "Now, Malice," Zack whispered, hoping that Brizza, attuned to him in the meld, would sense his anxiety. "Let us not be late." Back in the clerical anteroom of House Do'Urden, Malice and her subordinates continued their brutal mental assault on the clerics of House de Vere. Lothe heard their prayers louder than those of their counterparts, giving the clerics of House Do'Urden the stronger spells in their mental combat. Already they had easily put their enemies into a defensive posture. One of the lesser priestesses in de Vere's circle of 8 had been crushed by Brizza's mental insinuations, and now lay dead on the floor barely inches from Matron Genefie's feet. But the momentum had slowed suddenly, and the battle seemed to be swinging back to an even level. Matron Malice, struggling with the impending birth, could not hold her concentration, and without her voice the spells of her unholy circle weakened. At her mother's side, powerful Brizza clutched her mother's hand so tightly that all the blood was squeezed from it, leaving it cool, the only cool spot on the laboring female, to the eyes of the others. Brizza studied the contractions and the crowning cap of the coming child's white hair and calculated the time to the moment of birth. This technique of translating the pain of birth into an offensive spell attack had never been tried before except in legend, and Brizza knew that timing would be the critical factor. She whispered into her mother's ear, coaxing out the words of a deadly incantation. Matron Malice echoed back the beginnings of the spell, sublimating her gasps and transforming her rage of agony into